Mastroberardino, one of the iconic producers of Campania wines. In fact, one of the producers that really put Campania on the map. Now, before we go into a lot of details, I just want to tell you really quick about why I found Campania to be so incredibly interesting and important in my coming into wine. First and foremost, someone who loves Barolo, has always loved Italian wine in general. When I started really learning about Italian wine and starting to research it, and I found my way to Campania, what I found was a region that was actually quite unique in that it didn't just focus on one big wine. Yes, when we think of Campania, most people think Taurasi, okay? The great Aglianico. But the reality is that Campania is a diverse landscape with so many different climates, so many different important varieties, and a history that goes all the way back to Greek colonization, then the Romans, and then today, the modern day. And as we look back through that history, there is no other producer that is as closely tied and as closely focused on those native varieties as Mastroberardino. So Piero, welcome to Vinous Live. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad. It's an honor for me to be together and to share some information about the region and, of course, the family.
Well, one thing I definitely want to do today is I want to show some of the absolutely amazing photos and such that we have of your region as well as we talk, because I don't think a lot of people realize just how diverse the landscape really is in Campania. Some people think of, we look at Campania on a map of Italy, and obviously it's central Italy, okay? Many people think of it as the south, all right? But what a lot of people don't realize is that when you are in the south of Campania, you have these much more, this much warmer weather, much more fertile, more agricultural base. But there's also a lot of high elevations, a lot of mountains, a lot of volcanoes, Mount Vesuvius. One of the things that most of us hear about when we're getting into wine is we hear about about Pompeii. We hear about these ancient Greek colonies that originally planted these grapes. We hear about the Romans who then further brought that to the rest of Italy and then on into Europe. So what I'm really interested in knowing, because your family goes back some 10 generations in Campania, is that correct?
Yes. The family started.
Go ahead.
No, the family started this business at the beginning of 1700, so 10 generations before me. Yeah, and it's a quite a long story, because the first part of the history of the family was based on an approach to viticulture. So they were focused on investing in the region more, and this goes on and on up to mid 1800s. So the first century is focused on domestic market and on production more than the market approach. Then in 1850 we got a guy that is a kind of a pioneer, a member of the family, that educates his sons, 3 sons, to the approach to business, and these 3 men start exploring the possibility of opening foreign markets for wines of Irpinia. Irpinia is this very small region that is located in the inland of Campania, up on the mountains of the region. And so these guys decided to open a branch in Rome, and from Rome started shipping wines to Europe. And then in 1878, they opened also the American markets. Mm-hmm. This was really a turning point for the history of the family. We had a part of the family living in New York because of the first flow of immigration. Some people went there. And so they were the first base for the introduction of the wines in North America.
Can I just interject really quick and ask a question? At this time in history, was the family more purchasing grapes from farmers, or were they heavily involved in the agriculture as well?
Both. They traditionally, they always had some properties in the family, but they also had a part of the production that was coming from, farmers that were friends of the family. So these were a kind of, the focus, the central part of a network at that time. So they were the guys that were able to bring value back to the region, exporting wines.
And so, and when you move now into the 20th century and the changes that went on and how Mastroberardino really defined Campania wines. I mean, Campania, I remember when I first started learning about wine, and at that time, it wasn't considered, Fiano wasn't even considered as important a varietal as it is today. Fangina, Greco di Tufo, these weren't things that people talked about with as much respect as they do today. I'm really interested in how the decision was made and how it was maintained that Mastroberardino has focused only on the varieties within Campania. When was that decision made?
Well, this was a decision that was taken by my father, mainly, and it started after World War II. Consider that the family had been very successful before the war, and in that period, the export of our wines arrived in all the continents. In the late 20s and beginning of the 30s, we got the wines from Irpinia, from Mastroberardino family, covering all the continents. And then the war is a distraction for the markets and for the production. Many people leave the vineyard to go to the army, and of course we got bombings. The grotas that we have in the cellars became refugees against the bombings, and so the approach changed a lot. Even if they went on producing wine and harvesting the grapes even during the war. So we have bottles from the 40s that come from the period of the war, bottles of Taurasi that are from that period. And but the reconstruction of the company and also of the market started for the will, for the strength of my father, that had in memory the successes of the family of his father, and he wanted to give a big respect and honor to the history of the family. And so he decided to start a kind of a cultural battle to make people understand that in the area it would be a pity to leave the heritage of those grapes,
right,
and switch to easier approaches to viticulture that meant at that time, on one side, the possibility to plant Sangiovese and Trebbiano in the area because they were much more productive than the Aglianico, Fiano, and Greco, or on the other hand, the possibility to introduce international varietals, because in that period after the war, there is the start of the diffusion of international grapes also in Italy. And right. So he was a kind of the defender of this culture. So this means that this is the reason for bringing to him, the appellation of the archaeologist of grape and wine in 1980 by Hugh Johnson with the first book talking about Italian wines.
Well, it is amazing just how much of a pioneer he was. I go back thinking into, I remember a blind tasting that I was at that was, populated by a lot of very serious wine collectors and wine lovers. And bottles are being passed around, and finally this bottle comes to me and I pour it, and it's obvious it's a mature wine and such, and I put my nose at this glass, and it was just like my mind was blown. And once it was unveiled, it happened to be a 1977 Mastroberardino Taurasi Reserva, which I was just lucky enough to retaste. We're talking 10 years ago then. I was lucky enough to retaste only a few months ago, right before the most recent article I wrote. And now, no, please bring it to the screen. Let people see. It's absolutely amazing. You have these bottles in your cellar. That is gorgeous. And it's crazy to think, that's, I think, one of the biggest problems that people have bending their minds around Taurasi and such. It has this Barolo of the South that people call it. But I think what people make the mistake of is they don't actually check in on them when they're mature enough. I think too many people taste them young when they're all elbows and knees and the acidity is right in your face, and they're like, oh, I don't see where this is going. But if that same person were to taste a young Barolo, they'd have the same exact reaction, just, you know, different reasons, you know. But when we think about Antonio and we think about what he did, now let's go back to 1968, right? And the 1968 Reservas, and a man who decided that he would put vineyard names on Taurasi. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And so that's absolutely amazing to me. That is an inspiration. That is a perfect explanation. I mean, a perfect reasoning for people to go out and try to actually understand and find these wines, because only now are we starting to see more of this focus on place again in your region. So the 1968 Reservas. Okay, why? Well, first, how long did that go on for, and why did that direction change? How did it stop being about the different vineyard locations?
Well, this is an interesting topic. I mean, the approach after the war was one of research of the complexity of the appellation, trying to put together different locations, different terroirs, and doing the assembling in the cellar. This was the approach that my father followed up to 1978. So the whole period of the 50s, 60s, and mid-70s, all these wines were made assembling the grapes from the different locations. And this was considered the best way for the expression of the terroir, because as you know, Taurasi is not just one terroir. In the Taurasi appellation, we got 17 different villages, so it's quite big and wide, and it goes from north to south of the wine region of Irpinia, covering different environments. In the northern part, we got a little more, you know, hilly, more delicate environment, and also we have a little lower elevation of the vineyard area. And so we got maturation that is just 1 week before on the average as a standard, compared to the wines that come from the southern part, that is a very much harder environment, colder, with a little more snow. We got snow every year in the vineyard, usually because of the mountains, but the southern part is colder and the mountains are higher. So we go up to 650 meters of elevation. And so the wines are a little deeper with a very strong character, while the Taurasis from the northern part are a little more delicate and a little, just a little softer. Talking about Aglianico and Taurasi, of course. Right. So they are not soft in general, but they are a little more approachable.
Well, just for the people that are watching, but before I say this, let me just mention anyone, you know, guys, I know if I was watching this right now, I would have a ton of questions. So please, if you have any questions, send them on into me, and I'll make sure to try to weave them into our conversation as they become relevant. And I just want to make sure I get to every question now. So if you have something you want to ask this man, it is a rare opportunity. So please take advantage. So looking at what we have here on the screen, one thing I just want to mention to everybody that we don't necessarily see in this map. So this is a map of the Mastroberardino estates, but what we have here is we have Campania as a whole, and if we split right down the middle, we basically have a mountain range that goes right through the middle of Campania, which explains what Piero is talking about with those elevations and such. And throughout those mountains, you also have a lot of both extinct, you have extinct volcanoes, like you have Mount Masico up into the north. And then as you keep on going down, you have Vesuvius. It's absolutely amazing to look at the landscape of Campania and then understand how all of these different wine regions relate to each other. And as we start talking about the varieties that Mastroberardino specializes in, we'll also talk about the different locations and why those varieties work better in those locations.
Yeah, what is interesting to point out is the fact that Irpinia is so cold. I mean, many people know the region of Campania, as you were saying, for the coast, for Amalfi, Positano, you know, Pompeii, Napoli, and the Mount Vesuvio. But if you go just 50 kilometers east, it goes all the way up on the mountains, and the environment changes completely. So you got a lot of vegetation, a lot of green, very, very dark and intense, and you have this beautiful environment that is perfect to have the nice acidity that is typical of these wines. So we have the altitude, and we got also soils that are extremely interesting and varied, but they give a huge personality to these wines. So the wines from the mountains are completely different from the wines that come from the coast, from the Vesuvio area. Completely different in terms of winemaking, but also consider that in Irpinia, so from the mountains, we are the last wine region to harvest compared to any other wine region in Italy. So we harvest the whites in the second half of October, and we harvest the reds at the beginning of November.
Amazing. And did your father have any inspiration to ever explore, say, like Mount Masico and the terroir there, or to look toward the south, which has become very popular these days? Did he ever do any experimentation in those regions?
Yeah, well, the dream of my father was, first of all, to have the possibility to start a research project in Pompeii, because Pompeii is, you know, the witness of the history of the two branches, the two origins of our viticulture. In Pompeii, you have the Aminea grapes, so the Greek origin of our viticulture, but they were evaluated by the Romans, and the Romans had the capability to bring those grapes to a professional approach in terms of viticulture and training systems. You know, Romans were very good in the training of the vines. And so the Greek viticulture had a huge success under the Romans. And Pompeii is the typical place where my father was able to experiment. We started this project in 1996. So it's now almost 25 years that we have experimented in Pompeii. And we have there 15 different small vineyards that are located in the gardens of the most beautiful houses of the archaeological town, the Orto dei Fuggiaschi, the Foro Boario under the amphitheater, the Nave Europa. I mean, the most famous houses in Pompeii have the vineyards in the backyard. And so these small pieces of land, you know, now are the place where we train the vines, and we produce also a wine from there that is called Villa dei Misteri.
Yeah, it's an absolutely amazing story. And so just, you know, correct me if I make any mistakes here. So just so everybody is aware, if they're not already aware about this wine, is that Mastroberardino had basically gotten access to replant these ancient vineyards with the same varieties that would have been planted there at the time that Pompeii was destroyed, correct?
Yeah.
And
exactly also with the same training system, because in partnership with the archaeologists, we were able to locate each and every plant that was in each vineyard, in each garden. And so the replantation was made exactly in the same position. So you can see the density of plantation that we have in these vineyards. That is the one of the Romans, that was 4 square meters per 4 square meters. For foots, the Roman foots. That means 1.2 meters per 1.2 meter. So it's a density of plantation that is about 8,800 plants per hectare. That is huge, extremely, you know, dense. And it seems extremely modern in terms of viticulture. It's right. More than the average, the standard that we have today in our vineyards. Of course, we are on the slopes in a very high mountains, while in Pompeii it's flat. But it's interesting to see that the Romans in the urban viticulture were focused on the fact that density of plantation was the way to train the vines in that environment.
That's absolutely amazing. And I mean, the photos are absolutely amazing. We often talk about the ability to taste history in a bottle. I can't think of a better representation of this without, you know, going and finding a wine that's, you know, hundreds of years old and these shipwreck wines and such, but being able to taste the wine that's being made today in the same system, same variety, same locations, and then to see a picture like this. And that is Vesuvius off in the distance, correct?
Yes, exactly. Yes. Absolutely. And the picture is made from the amphitheater. So you got on the back the amphitheater, and in the front is Vesuvius.
So were these vineyards, were these vineyards actually covered in lava? Did this have to be excavated?
Yeah. There was a huge amount of lava, and then they did the excavation, and during the excavation they were able to locate the plants, and so they put the vineyard on the map, and they asked us to replant the vineyard as it was in the past.
That is absolutely beautiful. All right, so bringing it back a little bit to Taurasi, because I have a couple of questions here of people coming in that they're interested in knowing. And I know this is going to be like picking between your favorite children, but I have someone asking, which village do you consider to be able to produce the best Taurasi from the region?
Well, it really depends on the condition of each harvest. I mean, considering that the differences that we have, the variation of the environment, we have quite a big difference among the different locations. So if you look at the 68 Reserva, this was the first vintage in which my father produced 3 different crus. One was Montemarano, the second was Castelfranci, and the third was Piero d'Angelo. Piero d'Angelo was in the area of Taurasi village. So he put 3 different Taurasis together with the regular Taurasi Reserva that he produced in 68, in order to make people understand in this very beautiful harvest the differences of the 3 terroirs. So Montemarano is the hardest and coldest and highest. Castelfranci is a little in the middle, and the Taurasi area of Piero d'Angelo is a little lower. So this was his attempt to make a didactical approach in proposing wines in 68 that is still considered one of the very legendary harvests of the history of Taurasi.
And are these, many of these are some of the same sources that you're using today, correct? Not all of them, but some of them are?
Today, we have a little wider representation of the terroir, because we have the Radici Taurasi, that is, the descendant of the bottle of Taurasi that exactly. That this wine comes from Montemarano, so comes from the same cru of the 68 that I just showed. But we also have a Taurasi that comes from the estate that we have in Mirabella Eclano, that is called the Naturalis Historia. And here the approach is a little different, because, as I said, Mirabella is a little in the north. So here we got more delicate hills and a little different environment. This is Montemarano, that is very, close, and you have these mountains all around, and the environment is very cold. If you look at Mirabella, you will see that we have rounder hills, much more, delicate. And as I said, there is even about 1 week of difference in terms of maturation. So we harvest the grapes for Historia a little earlier than the ones that we have in Montemarano. This is also, Historia has another typicity, because this wine comes from vines that have, on the average, have about more than 50 years of age. So they are a little older. So here we have a less density of implantation, of course, and we have these huge plants with a very, very tiny production per plant. And in the case of Montemarano, we got some older vineyard, but in this case, this picture is about a little younger ones that are about 30, 35 years old.
Well, we're definitely getting into a lot more detail with the wines, everyone. But one thing I'm actually really interested in hearing about from you, Piero, is we go back in the history of Mastroberardino, and one of the things that I've heard a lot about in the past was the split of the winery between Walter and Antonio Mastroberardino. And what I had read is that Walter had taken much of the vineyards that your father had. Is that correct? And if it is, where did you then look to then grow again and expand again?
No, it's the company was just one, and in 1997 I bought the whole. So I bought the whole company from my cousins, and the estates were divided into the two different parts in the family. So a part was given to one side and the other to the other side. So, I mean, there was a kind of the division of the property at the time, but the seller remained under, the same side that was the one of Antonio Mastroberardino.
And from there, back together though, you brought the two halves back together.
No, they have a different winery, and they produce their own wines, and we are in a very good relationship with them, of course. But the companies are separated now.
Mm-hmm. But at that point, like, you did lose a good amount of the vineyard sources that you had when that split took place.
It was divided into two parts. Mm-hmm. So we kept our part, because the investments in the vineyards were made, from the families and not from the central company.
Right. I mean, which is
from there we started making new investments, and so we, expanded the properties of our own, and from 100 hectares we went up to 250. That is the property that we have today. We are a completely agricultural company that is based on its own production. So 250 hectares in the 3 DOCG appellations is quite complicated to manage, but it's interesting.
But I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that you have returned Mastroberardino to its former glory. I mean, you look at the last 15 years of production, if not more, and some absolutely amazing wines that have come out of your winery under your watchful eye. How did you get involved in wine? I mean, obviously you're in a family, you're growing up in this family, 10 generations and such, but your own interests in wine, how did that form?
Well, first of all, I mean, each of us grows up in the cellars. So I learned how to go on a bicycle in my cellar. I used to play soccer in the cellar when I was a kid. So this means that you have inside some feelings and some flavors. I mean, the flavors of the harvest come all the way up to your bedroom during October and November. And you go on smelling the harvest even in December. So there is a long period in your year in which those flavors are part of your everyday life.
Right.
So even if you're not working in the cellar, at some point, this is in your memories. And so every time I go downstairs, I mean, here, this is my house, and I live in the winery. When I go downstairs and it's harvest time, my memory goes back to those periods when I was a kid. So it's part of your life, first of all. And then when you're a kid, you start having the first experiences that are kind of, the playroom. You go to the vineyards and you start harvesting together with the workers. And this is a kind of, funny moments of your life when you're a kid, and you understand what is work at the same time. And then there were periods in which during summer, after some vacation, we went back to the cellar, and my father arranged some work for us. So we were at the time, when we were kids, we used to work at the boxes, put the bottles in the boxes. It's part of your experience, and then it remains inside yourself. But you also understand what is a company, what is an organization. You see that there is a kind of division of the jobs, and people collaborate in order to get some results. And I think that this is extremely important in the education of a child. And at some point, the company, mainly in the wine business, starts being something that is over the rationality of the decision-making process of a company. And it's a kind of emotion. So at that point, it's a little dangerous, but you start thinking of the company as really a part of your life. I mean, you cannot separate, your personal experience from the part that should be called business, but it's not really business.
Right.
Because it's something that you love. And that's why I have been working to, projects that at some point are dedicated to honor the history as a tribute to the professional life of my father. That's exactly what my father did. Because when my father produced these wines from the 60s or the 70s that were extremely successful, in his mind, he had...
Oh, yes. Love the Burgundy bottle, by the way.
This was the Taurasi before the war. This is from the 30s.
That is amazing.
And I also have some Taurasi from the 20s. It is right here.
Now, do you have enough of those in your library that to this day, do you still open these from time to time?
Yeah, sure. We still have, some samples of each vintage, so we are able to arrange quite interesting verticals.
It's amazing. And I'm assuming they're holding up beautifully?
Oh, yes. What is interesting is the fact that when you open a bottle from the 20s, that is almost 1 century old, for a Taurasi, 1 century in the good vintages is nothing. These are wines, when you open these bottles, these are wines that are very fresh, that are still expressing the character of the variety. I mean, it's really amazing. You don't have the idea of observing a monument. You want to match with food. You want to, pair. And this is the most important thing for a wine like Taurasi.
Oh, especially Taurasi and such, it screams for food. That is for sure.
Yes, definitely.
What's interesting
is typical of all the wines of the region.
There's actually, and we're definitely going to talk about that. There's so many things I want to talk about. That's the hard part about this conversation. There is actually a question, someone coming in here, where he's saying, how long do you prefer to sell your wines before opening? And I think it's really interesting because first thing I'm just going to put in there before I let you answer that is obviously vintage has a lot to do with that. But the fact that you just showed us a 100-year-old bottle that is still drinking is pretty incredible. But if you had to generalize, how long do you think someone should be keeping a bottle of Taurasi in their cellar before they're going to start to experience a more mature expression?
Well, it's not easy because it really depends on your personal taste and your personal approach to the tasting. Because there are people that love to have the first expression of flavors of fruits. So even when a Taurasi is young, today we have the possibility to present a wine that is perfectly balanced. If you taste the Reserva 14 that we have here, of course, it's
absolutely
a wine that needs to have some more time. But if you taste it, you have a wine that has a perfect balance. It's a wine that you can 100%. Drink and enjoy.
I do. I agree 100%. I mean, part of that, I think, is also, like I said, vintages. The 14 vintage does have a certain kind of like early appeal to it right now, even though I believe it's going to mature beautifully. But I remember tasting that a couple of months ago and just thinking to myself, oh my God, I can't imagine what this is going to mature into, but oh my God, it's so good already. So I'm right there with you.
Yeah. Then, if I must say, in my personal taste, I think that Taurasi starts switching towards the maturity after 20 years. So if I have to suggest to somebody that loves a little more mature wines, I would say 20 years is the turning point for Taurasi.
20 years.
Before, it's always very young. In the big vintages, if you open the bottle of 68 now, you will see that it's still too young for the tasting. Amazing. Because in the big vintages, Taurasi has, in some sense, this kind of problem. It's always young.
Mm-hmm. Going back to a couple of questions here. So actually, somebody I know very well, Giuseppe, is asking, are you hearing any word of there being any discussion to create any MGA designations for Taurasi? Is there any official, government distinctions being talked about?
Well, we got many debates on the evolution of the appellation rules, and we just had some small, not relevant changes in the last year in the rules of our appellation, and currently we don't have new changes going on in the next months. because it's really complicated, because in the EU, some rules are changing. So now if you want to do innovation in the appellation rules, it's not enough to go through your government, you have to go through Brussels. So it's becoming more and more complicated to change, the rules. But I think that we have a very good base of our 3 appellations. What is very unusual is that in Irpinia we got 3 DOCGs. One is Taurasi based on Aglianico, but we also have 2 white wines that are excellent, very important white wines of Italy that are beautiful DOCG appellations. And the 3 of them were based on my father's approach to wine. So each of them is based on 1 region and 1 grape varietal. So extremely distinctive. And I think that he did a very good job in building up these rules for the 3 appellations. And the good approach to writing those rules is seeable in the results of success for these 3 wines. That in Italy we got plenty of appellations. We got over 500 of appellations all over the country, and not all of them are successful because sometimes it's a little too complicated. Sometimes the consumer doesn't understand what is the style, what is really inside one appellation when you've got too many typologies inside. So the approach was extremely clear. We are in Irpinia, and sometimes it's difficult to talk about these unusual, unique grapes all over the world. So the consumer in Osaka probably has some troubles in understanding what is a Greco di Tufo. This was his approach in the 70s. And so I want to make it as clear as possible, because the consumer in Osaka has to memorize what is drinking, what are the flavors, what is the grape, what is the region, and who is the producer at the end.
Well, you bring up some really, really great points here. I have a question that applies to this, but also just want to mention everybody. So right now in New York, it's going to be like an 80-degree day. So when I was making a decision on what I was going to be opening up here today, I'm really glad that Piero mentioned this, because I ended up deciding that I was going to go with one of his new Fianos. That we're going to talk about this project in just a little bit. But guys, the funny thing is that, or I shouldn't say funny, but the most interesting thing is that, Mastroberardino, just as Piero was talking about, it wasn't just Taurasi and Aglianico that Mastroberardino really kept center stage in Campania. There was so much work that they did with Fiano and with Greco and their bottlings. Now, going back to my education, someone would say, if you really want to understand Greco di Tufo, then you go out and you get a bottle of Mastroberardino Greco di Tufo, and that will be your education. The question that I have here is from William Lawson, and he is asking, speaking of age, it is often said that Fiano can age well. Do you think that this is also the same for Greco? And I know what you've got behind you on that wall. How would you define the differences between the 2, both sites, Avellino versus Tufo? But first, let's answer the first question. Fiano can age. Can Greco age?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the region, there are almost 2 parties: people for Fiano and people for Greco. They are completely different wines. They are completely different grapes, and Greco has more structure. Fiano is more on elegance and finesse, usually. We respect a lot what happens in the vineyard in order to have in the glass more and more, the flavor of the soils. So in the case of Greco, this is the Novacella that you just showed. This is the cru that started in the late 70s. As I said, the approach of my father at some point changed it, because up to the mid 70s, this is a bottle of Greco di Tufo from the 60s.
Amazing.
And in this period, the approach to the production of these wines, as I said before, was one of assembling grapes from different properties of the family. While in 78, he changed his mind and he started producing the single vineyard wines. So the Nova Serra that you just mentioned is a single vineyard that goes back to the late 70s. And this has been a huge success for us during the 80s and 90s. The project that you mentioned that is called Stilema goes back to the style of my father of the 70s. So before the focus on the single vineyards. So Stilema for all the wines is again a multi-vineyard approach.
And this is 24 months on the lease, am I correct?
24, yes. 24 months on the lease.
I mean, wow, the aromas are just out of this world. Please continue.
No, but I mean, what I'm looking for on the technical side is the will to give a tribute to my father, but at the same time to go towards his will of going back to the flavors of his childhood. My father, during the years, was more and more worried about the fact that with the evolution, the grapes and the vines were, in some sense, losing some characters. So yes, we need to go back to the flavors of my childhood. So the research was based on the clonal selection from Phylloxera, vineyard, and we started refocusing on the origins of these grapes. So these wines are going towards this target, this approach.
Are these, I'm sorry, are these grafted vines?
Yeah.
Grafted? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, sure. And so for all the three appellations, we started working in 2014 to this project. The first wine that came out was a Fiano di Avellino Stilema 2015, was the first release. Then we released the Taurasi Stilema 2015. And the third is the one that I just displayed. That is the Greco di Tufo Stilema 2017. So the project is made of three wines. All of them try to refocus on the approach of my father of the 60s and 70s. So they are extremely modern wines, as you can see at the tasting, but they are the descendants of the ancient approach of the period in which my father was more successful, the period in which he was able to put Irpinia on the map again, remembering what his father did in the 30s.
I just want to mention, you said, went to everyone that is watching, when Piero says extremely modern, he's not meaning what the average consumers think of when you hear extremely modern wines. These aren't big internationally styled wines. They're just made through modern approaches, modern winemaking techniques and such. But yeah, no, this is absolutely amazing. Like I said, I'm tasting the Fiano right now. I can't wait to taste the Aglianico, the Taurasi and the Greco as well. From the Taurasi, we know that you blend a lot of vineyards and such. This wine is coming from multiple vineyards, correct? Now, so how does it differ from, say, Ribisi, the vineyard?
Ribisi comes from one single area, while that is Monte Marano, that is the coldest one. In this case, for Stilema, we are having a different approach because we have the possibility to do, as I said, a vertical tasting that goes back 1 century. This is a big opportunity, not only for the pleasure of tasting good wines, but also it allows us to understand what is the evolution of the style of production of the viticulture. This is extremely interesting because from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, we see the changes in the style of the wines. That is the change in the creativity of the producer. We got nature and we got man in a wine. Nature is the environment and is a condition that you cannot manage. But creativity of man is made of interpretation of nature. So if you look at the evolution of these wines, you will see that before the war, the alcohol content was higher, even if the wines are perfectly balanced. But if you go to the 60s, you will see that here the wines are down to 12.5, and a huge finesse, elegance, and a beautiful agility in the glass. Then in the late 90s, we got a change. In the mid 80s, we have a change in the viticulture. So Radici project is a turning point for us because my father changed the approach to viticulture, higher density of implantation. We had the possibility to increase and improve the maturation of the grapes. At the end, we got wines that suffer a little less compared to the past in terms of bitterness of the polyphenols during the maceration process. We manage better and better the maceration process. In the late 90s, the approach changes because we are able to extend the maceration. So the concentration of the wines after 1999 is higher, and we got much more fruit that is, and the deeper color in the Taurasi of the 2000s. And this is something that made a huge success for this wine in that period. With the Stilema Taurasi 2015, I'm going back to the style of the Taurasi of the 60s. So here you will see again the agility in the glass, more transparency, less fruit, less concentration, much more spices, more exotic at the nose. And this is exactly what I love to taste, because this is the style of Taurasi that I experienced when I was a child, when I was 16, 18 years old. This was the Taurasi that I used to have on my table with my father on Sunday lunch, and listening to his explanation, listening to his thoughts during the tasting. This is something that I wanted to repropose.
And I do notice on the back here, 13% alcohol from the 2015 vintage is actually quite impressive.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I have a series of questions from someone here that kind of all fit together. I'm going to try to sum this up the best I can. But David is asking, so we did touch on this a little bit, but I guess it's about time that we really start digging into the range of your different Taurasi. He is asking what the differences are between the Taurasi Ribisi versus the Ribisi Reserva. And what he's really asking is, is it specifically from one cru? Does it depend on the vintage conditions? Do you change where you source the fruit from between two different crus, between different vintages? Basically, what are the differences between the Ribisi and the Ribisi Reserva?
Yeah. Okay. Radici, that is the black label.
Which means roots, correct?
Yes, roots. Yeah, exactly. Radici is a blend of two different vineyards. Mm-hmm. One is the big estate of Monte Marano, and the other comes from a part of the estate of Mirabella. So it's still, it's a way that is in the middle between the multi-vineyard and the cru approach. So this is the style that Radici Taurasi has always had in the past. So we are going on proposing the Radici Taurasi in this way because this made the success of this wine. This means that in this wine we have complexity coming from the depth of the grapes coming from Monte Marano, but a little more softness that comes from Mirabella Estate. Mm-hmm. And the Riserva is 100% selection of grapes coming from the upper part of Monte Marano estate. So in terms of viticulture, it comes from the coldest area of our Taurasi appellation. And if you look at the two wines, putting them in the same in the glasses and comparing them at the same time, you will see the difference in color. But you also will experience the difference in texture. Mm-hmm. Here in the Riserva, you've got a much deeper approach and intense. Here we got a little more roundness, and the fruit is a little more delicate, and the wine is a little more approachable. On this wine, you can pair easily a T-bone steak.
Right.
On this wine, you love to go to seasoned cheeses, to things that are a little more intense.
I'm sorry, but the Reserve is not made in every vintage, correct? And what makes that decision made?
But even the Radici Taurasi is not made all the vintages, because there is the problem of the maturation. As I said, we harvest at the beginning of November. And this means that we are in a period that is very cold, but also very humid. The month of October can make the difference. If you have in October a lot of rain, you don't pick the grapes at all. So if you have some rain in the second part of October, you have a hard selection of grapes. And sometimes you don't produce the Riserva, and you can produce only the black label of Radici Taurasi. So in the recent years, we did not produce any bottle of the Riserva from the 13 vintage and from the 10 vintage. But if you go back to 2002, we did not produce any Taurasi in 2002, 0 bottles in that vintage. So it happens quite often.
Right, absolutely.
But at the same time, I must say that the fact that we harvest very late is also an opportunity, because in this period of global warming, when you have such a late maturation of the grapes, you don't suffer a lot in August, what happens in many other parts of the country. You don't suffer a lot the high temperature.
Right.
And you get into September when you're not yet in the topic part of the maturation process. And in September here is cold. So it refreshes a lot the vineyards. And so even if it's hot in the summer, sometimes September helps us to slow down a little bit maturation and to have the possibility to bring the grapes in a slower process to a better maturation condition.
I have a question here actually that is great because it goes right to something else I really wanted to talk to you about. We have someone who's asking about your thoughts of using Botti Amberic for Taurasi, pros and cons. But what I'm also interested in adding to that. So Botti Amberic, pros and cons. So all of your wines from Radici Reserva, Naturalis Historia, these all see some level of new wood, French oak, correct? With the Naturalis Historia seeing all French oak, correct? So what is the decision-making process here? And you know, why all French oak on this one wine? And you know, what are your pros and cons using Barrique with Botte? You know, what's the decision-making process there?
Okay, for the Radici wines, we use mainly the big casks. Mm-hmm. So we have the bigger part of the process, 60% of the aging goes through casks that are 48 hectoliters.
Okay.
The medium big ones. While 40% goes through used French barriques.
Excellent.
So
okay.
Not first passage, but the second passage. And this is because I mean, the contribution of wood in these wines must be extremely, extremely delicate. Right. We want the micro-oxygenation from wood. We don't want a flavor contribution on these wines. So, of course, we need the wood to make wine breath during the process, but we don't want to, constrict the wine in an environment that hits the flavors. In the case of Historia, we use used French oak again, so it's not new, but it's used, but it's 100% French oak in this case, because the different location, the different starting condition of the grapes made us, make a different experiment in this case, trying to understand the higher softness of the environment of Mirabelle estate for these grapes, how it could match with a softer wood, because the French oak, of course, gives a little softer contribution in the process.
And
so
when
in
did
this
that
case,
start?
We tried to.
When did that start in the history of Mastroberardino? When was any form of even second pass, third pass, small French oak? When was that added in?
In the 80s. In the 80s, we have a contribution of this, smaller casks in the process. In the late 80s, in the second half of the decade, even if in the tradition of the family, we got pictures of these barriques from the late 1800s and beginning of 1900s. They were called carati or carratelli, and they were produced inside the cellars. We got the pictures of people working at the at the casks and preparing them. But they were used mainly for the shipments, more than for the aging. They were used for shipping.
Interesting. Okay, so sorry, we are running out of time, and I feel like we could keep on going for another hour easily. And so I just want to make sure I get to everybody here. What is your smallest production wine?
Well, the one that you opened, that is the Stilema Fiano di Avellino. Yeah, this has been produced in this vintage in 2,800 bottles.
Wow.
Yeah. We got many wines that are produced in very, very tiny production, but I mean, the cruise, like the Radici Fiano or the Nova Serra Greco di Tufo, these are made in 60,000 bottles, more or less, every year, depending on of course, on the vineyard. But the Stilema line is the tiniest one, because it's a very, very complicated process. And also the selection of grapes is something very interesting. I mean, the assembling of grapes is a strategic part of the process in order to understand what is going to happen, in the process, starting from the tasting of the berries. That is another very fascinating part of the job.
And then from the last recent vintages, can you just give us, again, we're really running out of time here, but something I definitely want to talk about really quick. Can you give me a little bit of your thoughts, some short thoughts on some of the most recent vintages that people should be looking for? Let's just handle it like this. Like what are the top two vintages in your mind the last 10 years for Taurasi versus Fiano versus Greco? So people know what to look for.
Okay, to describe the best vintages of Taurasi, we have to go back in a range of 20 years, at least more than 10, because in the first 10, it's really too young. I mean, of course, I can easily say that 2015 is a perfect vintage for us, because nature was extremely good with our grapes. So we got perfect grapes in the cellars, and we didn't have to work a lot in the cellar. That is very good to preserve all the characters from the vineyards. But I would go a little, a little more into the past to understand which is the style of Taurasi that I look for. And I would say that in my heart, I still have the 2004 Reserva. 2004 was a very amazing vintage. And we also had a huge success with the 2001 and 2000, with the 99, that were also very interesting vintages. The legends, if you want to give this information to the people, the legends of our history are 77, the one that you tasted, 68, 61, and 58. These are 4 vintages that are excellent for collectors.
And let me just put in there, guys, really quick, that you can still find these wines if you really, really look out for them. Make sure they come from well-stored places. But the best part about them is that the wines he's talking about, they're not cheap, but they're also not ridiculously, out of this world expensive where you cannot possibly afford them. But Piero, please continue.
Yeah, it's right. I mean, if you go through collectors, sometimes the collectors, put their cellars on the market, so you are able to enter in, at some point in a private negotiation, and you can have a very good value for these vintages. And after 77, we have the 85. That is another excellent vintage. That is the vintage that, if you find it, is extremely interesting wine. So these are the bottles that I look for usually, because I try to buy again all this wine. I got plenty of these wines in my cellars, but I try always to buy them because I love to have a patrimony, a library of vintages of my family. As I was lucky from my father to receive, a huge representation of the different vintages of one century, I would love to do the same with the next generation that is coming.
History in a bottle, definitely. And then really quick, Greco and Fiano, what are the more recent vintages people should be looking for, in your opinion, for Greco and Fiano?
Well, for Fiano, I mean, the 2015 of Stilema that is already sold out was excellent, really excellent.
2,000 something bottles. I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it's tough, but if you find it, it's really amazing. But I mean, for Fiano, I would talk about 15-year range to understand what happens with the start of the evolution, because Fiano can easily be tasted after 40 years. So 15 years, in my opinion, is a good turning point. We got beautiful bottles of the 2007 of Fiano, of Greco, were very good vintages, but also 2009 was interesting. So I mean, we've got some good vintages that are interesting to understand what is the potential of the whites of Irpinia. In my opinion, are still a little bit underestimated.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully conversations like this will start opening people's minds to that. And then lastly, Greco.
Well, Greco is a little different from Fiano. So Fiano suffers a little less the high temperature, Greco a little more. So when it's a hot harvest, it's better to go on Fiano. Right. When it's a little colder, it's better to go on Greco. So, I mean, it's really a little different. I mean, if you go to 2002, that was very rainy, Greco can be better than a Fiano. And sometimes in 2007, Greco suffers a little more because of the higher temperature. So you must understand a little bit more what is the environment here and how it matches with the grape varietals. And then you can easily choose even the vintages, knowing what happens here. So I'm available to give any information to all the consumers. You know, we are in touch with everybody today with the technology. This is very good. Totally. I receive every day questions that are weird questions from people from all over the world.
I really wish I could have gotten to all the questions that we have today, but we are really out of time, everybody. First, let me just say thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, this was, for me, this was a great session because there was so much here we talked about that I wanted to talk to you about. And for the audience, just so you guys know, I literally only got through about half of what I had just written down that I really wanted to talk to them about to get out there. But just kind of sum this up before we say goodbye, circling back to the beginning, you know, we talk about Campania, we think about Taurasi. Obviously, it's, you know, that is the big thing coming out of Campania, but there's so much more. And here we are, we're talking to one of the pioneers of the region, a family going back 10 generations that has never lost their steam. They've never lost their passion. They continue to this day to be looking at the region's history, at the varieties that put Campania on the map, and they are putting them out there to the world. And we are not talking about wines that are going to cost you hundreds of dollars. All right. We are talking about world-class wines that you can put in your cellar, you can buy by the case, and you can watch them mature for decades. So thank you again so much, Piero. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing to everybody before we get going?
I hope that everybody have a chance to come to visit Irpinia and Campania, because the best way to understand these flavors that are in the glass is to put the hands in the soil.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we didn't even talk about food today.
Oh,
that'll
yes.
be next time. Next time. It'll be Eric and Piero cooking up Campania cuisine.
Excellent. Okay.
Excellent, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, Piero. Thank you so much. Until next time, everybody, thank you for watching.